Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Political Forum. Today is November 24, 2020. But in some ways, it feels like we're still stuck in November 24, year 2000, because we had a very contentious election. The outcomes were very close. And although we have a putative president-elect, the election litigation is still going on, and we don't have a clear, decisive victor yet in terms of one side conceding and the other side moving forward. So to make sense of all this, we have two esteemed panel of experts. So please join me in welcoming Richard Berry Esquire. Richard has been nationally recognized as being the highest lawyer ratings organizations and publications for his trial and appellate work. In year 2000, Berry represented George W. Bush in the Florida litigation that determined the presidency. In that capacity, he effectively managed 47 cases throughout the state of Florida. In some cases, he personally argued before the court. His performance before a national audience earned him the National Law Journal's Lawyer of the Year designation in year 2001. And then in year 2006, he was designated as being 100 most influential lawyers in America. Berry concentrates his practice in the fields of complex commercial litigation, constitutional law, and appellate law. He has successfully argued 4 cases before the US Supreme Court and hundreds of cases before the federal and state and appellate courts throughout the US. In addition, he has advised and represented all 3 branches of the government, including both the Democratic and Republican governors, the legislatures, members of Congress, and multiple executive branch agencies, as well as individual officers and candidates. Hello, Berry, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you. I get famous again every 10 or 20 years now, depending upon how smoothly presidential elections go. And I've been asked many times in the past month how the 2000 litigation compared to now, and the answer is not really at all. About the only comparison is both of them involved the selection of presidential electors. The 2000 election was a legitimate legal dispute in which Gore was challenging enough votes to change the election. As a matter of fact, the number of votes that were in question were well beyond the margin between the 2 candidates, and his challenges were significant challenges that arose from a real problem. The initial result, and some of you may remember this, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a blow-by-blow description of some of the events that happened that many people are not aware of. The initial result on election night was a difference of 1,784 votes. Bush was ahead by that number of votes, which was 0.03% within the state of Florida. There was an immediate automatic machine recount triggered by the fact that it was within 0.5%. And after the machine recount, the margin had been reduced to 327 votes. When I refer to a machine recount, it means they just take the ballots and run them through the machine again, as opposed to a hand recount where every one of the ballots is held up and inspected by hand. The problem in 2000, when I said it was a real problem, was a problem of ballot design, and it involved 2 defective ballots. Florida, like a lot of jurisdictions at that time, was experimenting with different types of ballots. They were using some electronic monitors, they were using different types of paper ballots, and 2 of the ballots created the problem in 2000. The first one was a punch card ballot. I'm going to share my screen here. punch card ballot was a ballot that was laid on top of a form that had little holes in it. And you would use a stylus to punch the little portion of the card beside the name you were voting for, and that theoretically would force the little piece of cardboard, which came to be known as a chad, a new word that came into the American lexicon in the 2000 election. But it didn't always work. Sometimes the chad was pushed out partially. Sometimes the center was pushed in so that when you looked at it from the back, it looked pregnant. That was called a pregnant chad. If it was hanging by one or two corners, it was a hanging chad. There were 61,000 undervotes. In other words, 61,000 of the ballots were rejected by the machines because the machine saw no vote had been cast. So it was at that point that the decision had to be made by the Gore team whether or not to challenge and how they would challenge it. It made sense when you had a difference between the parties of only eventually 537 votes out of 61,000 that had been rejected. So you had two choices at that time under Florida law. Florida law had been cobbled together over a long period of time, and it was highly inefficient. It provided a candidate with two options to challenge the election. The first was called a protest, and that allowed the candidate to select any one or more than one of the counties in which to request a manual recount. So you could select one, or you could select any number up to 67 in which you would select a recount. The other option was to go into a court and demand a statewide recount immediately. This has been a topic of continuing study and discussion among election experts and scholars because of the question of whether the right decision had been made. Like this year, the decision had to become final in a state by what was a given number of dates prior to the meeting of the Electoral College, which in 2000 was December 12th. This year it's December 8th, or the state lost all of its electors. They weren't counted. So the Gore team was fighting time. The advantage of the protest, the county by county protest, is control because Gore could have selected those counties in which he had done well and enough votes had been rejected so that there would be a significant chance that he would be able to make up the margin. On the other hand, it was time consuming. The alternative, which was to immediately seek a statewide hand recount, had the advantage that it wouldn't lose the number of days necessary for the protest. It had the disadvantage that you were basically throwing the dice. Nobody knew who was going to win on a statewide recount. So Gore chose the protest route initially. And then when that was not successful, he went with the second bite of the apple. So these are the four counties that he chose: Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, and Volusia.
The uniformity of how
Stop this for a minute. This is an important, we're all learning to do this. Here's what happened. The counties each decided what the standards would be for the hand recount. This had never happened before. So each county has adopted its own standards. So one county might say, we're going to count every ballot where any single corner of the chad remains attached. Another county might say there have to be 3 corners attached, or all 4 of them have to be dislodged. Another county, and by the way, these actually happen in different counties. Another county might say, as long as there's any mark on the ballot that seems to indicate what the voter wanted to do, we would do that. So David Boies, who was the lead counsel for Gore, traveled to several of the counties to persuade them to adopt the most liberal standard. He went to Broward County in person. We were having hearings before the boards, and he was successful in persuading Broward County to adopt a very liberal standard. They essentially counted any ballot where there was anything on it that indicated who the voter wanted to vote for. He then went to Palm Beach County, where he and I didn't go to Broward, but I went to Palm Beach as well, and we both argued. And Palm Beach County went the other direction. They adopted a very stringent standard. The only time they would count a ballot is if all corners were dislodged. So Boys won a victory in Broward County, but as you'll see, it would prove to be a Pyrrhic victory. Eventually, the case reached the Florida Supreme Court, and what I was about to show you and will show you now was a key argument by Boys to the Florida Supreme Court. And what I want you to watch is a question and answer between Boys and Justice Pariente.
Is the uniformity of how these manual recounts are conducted essential to the integrity of the process or also to the constitutionality of the statute?
Your Honor, I think it is important to the integrity of the process. I think very wide variations, you could raise constitutional problems.
Well,
I would say that I think that for the reasons that you point out, it is quite this court be as specific as possible in terms of the standard to be applied so that we will have uniformity.
Now, the problem was the Supreme Court didn't set any uniform standards. Boys was very smart. He's a very smart lawyer, and he anticipated the problem that he was eventually going to have. Now, this is what he said. I think if you had very wide variations, you could raise a constitutional problem. This is what happened. In Broward County with the liberal standard, they were retrieving 60 times more ballots that had been machine rejected than in Palm Beach County. 60 times more ballots, only because of the more liberal standard. When the case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, the Supreme Court, the reason that 7 out of the 9 justices voted in favor of Bush was because of the finding that due to the lack of uniformity, the vote statewide didn't meet equal protection standards. So it was that failure of the Florida Supreme Court to adopt uniform standards that resulted eventually in the loss of that case by Gore. Nevertheless, while it was the punch card ballot that caused a 36-day delay in certification of the election, and it was the punch card ballot that the whole world watched in the 47 cases that I had to manage, it was not the punch card ballot in retrospect that lost the election for Gore. It was another ballot that was defective. That was the Palm Beach County ballot, which was known as the butterfly ballot. The butterfly ballot was a good faith attempt by the Palm Beach supervisor of elections to deal with a very large ballot. And what she did was she designed a ballot that looked like this. So it had flaps, and you would vote for candidates on one side and the other side, and then you would swing the page around to get to the next one with the additional candidates or constitutional amendments. The problem was that this was confusing. If you look carefully, you'll see that Al Gore, now you punched, the stylus punched those little holes in the center spine there. Al Gore was the 3rd hole in the center. George Bush, however, he was the 2nd name on the left. The 2nd hole was Pat Buchanan. So people who wanted to vote for Al Gore and punched the 2nd hole were voting for Pat Buchanan. And here's what the result was. Oh, by the way, this was a newspaper cartoon of the Palm Beach ballot the next morning, which wasn't far from accurate. So this is what happened. Pat Buchanan, who was a right-wing bigot, got his largest vote in the state of Florida in one of the most liberal counties in the state with his worst demographic. He got 3,411 votes out of 433,222 in Palm Beach. Compare that to Broward County, which had many more votes cast, 575,552, and which was a more conservative county in which Buchanan only got 795 votes. Or Miami-Dade County, which had over 652,000 and Buchanan only got 560 votes. There was no question that most of the votes that Buchanan got in Palm Beach County were because of the butterfly ballot, and Buchanan himself said it was nuts and it was because of that. So that's what lost the election. The problem was there was a hearing in Palm Beach before Judge Labarga, who was then on the circuit court, is now in the Supreme Court, and Judge Labarga correctly ruled that you couldn't redo that election because of the provision in the federal statutes that says that the election shall take place on one day in the entire country, Tuesday next after the first Monday in November. So there was a problem with the Palm Beach County ballot, but there was no way to fix it. Compare that to today and to what's been happening since November 3rd, in which there has been a battle with no problem. The Bush cases that have been filed have been cases with no factual basis and no substantial legal argument. As to what's going to happen, there's really only one thing remaining now, which is the decision out of the trial court in Philadelphia that was appealed to Judge Brand, who is a conservative Republican member of the NRA and the Federalist Society, and who the Trump lawyers were hoping was going to be friendly to them, and who in fact wrote the strongest order against them of any of the many orders that were written, in which he called their complaint Frankenstein monster, and he castigated them for filing a lawsuit with no substantial legal arguments and no factual support. They've appealed that. I am confident that the appellate court will affirm, and I believe that the US Supreme Court will not even hear the case. So with that, I'll leave it to the rest of you to ask questions when the time is appropriate. I'll be happy to stay with you as long as you're interested.
Okay, thank you, Barry. And now I'm going to introduce you to our second panelist. He is Matthew Doig. Matthew is a network investigations editor for USA Today, and he has been an investigative reporter and editor since 2001 for various news organizations in the states of Florida, New York, Washington, and California. Among other awards, he's a three-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. Hello, Matthew. Welcome.
Hey, everybody. Good to be here. Let me see if I can share my screen as well as Barry did.
And while that's being loaded, I'll just briefly introduce you to the next topic, which will be discussing the alleged systemic voter fraud that supposedly took place during this election. And a lot of this kind of raises the issue of voter integrity in our system. So that's the next topic that Matthew will discuss. Go ahead.
Is everybody seeing what I have on my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So there's just my contact information there. If anybody has any dynamite tips or anything like that, feel free to reach out. So I just wanted to kind of highlight a couple stories that we did before this election. We had a reporter working with Columbia Journalism Investigations and PBS Frontline on some voter access issues. And this was one of the first big stories that we did. It's not necessarily on voter fraud, it's on ballot rejections, which do kind of go hand in hand. Mostly because this is a real problem, legitimate ballots being rejected all across the country. in previous elections, we took the numbers of absentee ballots that had been rejected for all sorts of reasons. Some of them are kind of clear cut. If somebody gets their ballot in after the election day postmark, that's kind of clear, it's going to be tossed. But then there are all these other kind of confusing issues for voters. Like some states have multiple envelopes. You take your ballot, you put it in the privacy envelope, and then you're supposed to put it in the mail envelope. But there were states that when they got it, if you didn't have it in the privacy envelope, they were rejecting that ballot. So what we did is we took those rejection numbers state by state from prior elections and applied it to what was expected to happen in this election, when there was going to be a record number of people voting by mail-in ballot, which is essentially the same thing as an absentee ballot. And as you can see in the headline, that projection showed that there were going to be more than 1 million, at least 1 million people rejected kind of under the old standards. Now, I'm glad we did this. We kind of hedged it in the story because a number of states adopted what is known as kind of cure provisions, which is basically, it's not a do-over, but if there was a voter who forgot to put their ballot in the privacy envelope and mailed it in, election officials could contact them and say, hey, you forgot to do this, or you forgot to sign, or you forgot to have a witness signature, and basically ensure that the voter's intent was carried through. So this is a graphic we ran in that first story before the election. If you go online, this is interactive, and you can hover over each state and it'll show the numbers and everything like that. But anyway, it was projected for this election to be a pretty significant factor, including in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Florida that were going to be, key swing states. Now, we don't have the final numbers. As everybody knows, this is kind of dragging on, and not everybody has certified the results, and even those that certified the vote count have not necessarily finalized the rejection numbers and everything. But what we're seeing on preliminary returns is that the rejection rate this election is going to be significantly lower than our projection because of all these cure provisions. It's particularly interesting, I think, assuming it all pans out, is in Georgia, where I think we were projecting that there would be like over 100,000 rejected ballots in Georgia, and those rejections predominantly occur in high minority jurisdictions, which tend to go for Democrats. So the Georgia election was obviously pretty key, pretty close. If the rejection numbers had carried through the way they had in prior elections, very easily could have gone to Trump instead of Biden. So let's look to the next one here. So this is more kind of on point here, is this idea of voter fraud. And Barry kind of touched on this. Mass voter fraud is not a thing in the United States. The kind of best catalog of voter fraud is kept by the Heritage Foundation. If you go to their website, they have a database, and they basically kind of curated all the voter fraud instances they could find. I think it goes back to 1982. And then they break it down by different types, including by absentee ballot fraud and, I can't remember the other kinds, but there's a whole database and you can tweak it and everything like that. You can break it down by state. The bottom line, though, is that, they go back to 1982 or so, and there are a total of about 1,200 cases in there. So if you think about, there were 150 million or so votes cast in this election. Imagine how many votes have been cast and this is not even just presidential elections that they've cataloged in their database. They have I think there's even like a homeowners association election in there that they cite as a case of fraud. But if you think about all the elections that have occurred going back to 1982, and them only cataloging 1,200 or so cases, that is a fraction of a percent of all the ballots that have been cast in that time. But anyway, but they also call that, they don't say that their database is a comprehensive accounting of all voter fraud that has ever happened. They call it a sample. But, if anybody knows anything about statistics, a sample is supposed to be a smaller portion of the entire universe and shed some light on that. But if you look even at the cases that they have cataloged, none of them point to any kind of like mass voter fraud conspiracy, particularly on a presidential level. There are legitimate cases of election fraud, and those range from things, that it could be chalked up to like voter confusion. I mean, we have, our lead anecdote in this story is somebody who like moves down the street, crosses town boundaries. This was in, I think it was Montana. Very similar address, but they forgot to update their address, basically wound up voting in the wrong precinct and were charged with election fraud, this couple. By definition, sure, that's election fraud, but that is not some sort of like conspiracy involving people in a back room fixing ballots. Now, let me see what else we got here. Oh, this is a print, like a sample of the Heritage Foundation voter fraud thing. So that you can see they've got a catalog there by state, by year, the name of the people involved, the type of fraud. So what we did is, out of that 1,200, we isolated the absentee ballot cases, since that was kind of most similar to what President Trump had been alleging before the election, that there was going to be this mass fraud of the mail-in ballots. If you just isolate those type of cases, the number gets down to around 250, so an even smaller percentage of the overall vote. And even those are bloated. You can see here on the New Mexico cases, you've got 2 instances of one case, basically. So it's like, it's 2 people involved. So it's makes it look like there's 2 cases when in fact it's only 1 case. But so we had a team of reporters pulling all these cases, contacting people involved, pulling the court records to find out what was really behind these things. And, it was all small scale stuff that I'm sure happened in this election too. One of the things we saw a lot of is it'll be a husband and wife, and the husband dies after the absentee ballot has already been requested, and the wife says, this is the candidate I know he wanted to vote for. So she votes for him, signs it, sends it in. By the letter of the law, you're not supposed to do that. That's voter fraud. But again, that is not the kind of fraud that is going to tip an election either way. Now, we did find a handful of, like kind of honest to God fraud attempts, like something, Ocean's 11 style, where people are gathering together and trying to sway an election. But every case we found, and first of all, there are very few of those. Everyone we found was, almost always a very small jurisdiction. It'll be like the mayor of some small town or something like that. It's like the mayor and his brother-in-law get together and go around town, telling, either intimidating voters or bribing them with some cigarettes and alcohol or something like that. And invariably, somebody calls the police and says, hey, they're going around town trying to pressure me into filling out my ballot a certain way. And the cops get involved, and there's a prosecution, and that's how it winds up on the heritage fraud list. And Barry probably knows this case, probably the largest scale fraud attempt involving, a largish jurisdiction would have been like the Miami mayoral race in 1997, which was, kind of riddled with fraud. But, one of the things we found is that there are traps in place to catch these things. If you can't have lots of dead people voting because they match the voter rolls up against the Social Security death index. And there are just other ways to catch, any type of fraud attempt. In fact, after this election, this is my last slide here. The story was recently in the Los Angeles Times, Hawthorne, California, which is like population 50,000 or something like that. There was a mayoral candidate, and it was either his brother or one of his supporters or something like that were going around trying to get ballots in the names of dead people, but they were sending them to like 3 different PO boxes, and the scheme was blown up before it could even get started, because you can't have bulk ballots mailed to PO boxes in the names of dead people without attracting law enforcement attention. So, we've looked into some of the claims that have been made in this election, and Barry is far more of an expert than I am, but I'm glad he kind of said what I believe also, is that there really are no legitimate issues in this election. By all accounts, it was kind of clean and orderly, and everything went on as it should have. There aren't very many comparisons, I think, to the 2000 election, because I mean, you saw Barry credit the others, the lawyers making the other side of the argument. In this one, you don't even have supporters of Rudy Giuliani and company going out there saying, yeah, Rudy's making a good argument here. I can see where this might be going somewhere. These are just like a bunch of wild claims being made in press conferences. And then you can see even in the court filings, they're not willing to go as far as they are in the press conference, which in a way is I think, them telling on themselves. So, you know, I think this is, it's a stretch to compare this to the very many legitimate issues that came up in the 2000 election. I mean, even beyond what Barry said, if anybody remembers, I don't think there was a legal argument on this, but like the media called Florida for Gore pretty early. And there was an argument at the time that could have depressed turnout, like in the panhandle, even of Florida, and even, as in the center part of the country and West Coast, because Florida was so pivotal. So like, I mean, you could have even made a legitimate argument then. The media calling that early could have influenced the election, and the media's kind of learned lessons from that. But this one, there aren't very many or at all legitimate arguments being made in the aftermath of this election. And you can see that as court case after court case kind of falls apart for the Trump team. So that's about it on my end, and happy to answer any questions when it comes to it. Let me stop sharing here.
Okay, thank you, Matthew, for that presentation. And we're going to move on to the second segment, where I will ask some questions to both of our panelists based on their presentation. In the meantime, if you have questions you want to ask, start thinking about what you want to ask, and then you could raise your hand using the app function, and you could direct those questions for the third segment. So going back to Barry's presentation, seems like if I could sum up Bush v. Gore in like one sentence, it came down to equal protection. When you have different standards for ballots, that deprives certain equal protection to voters because they are entitled to certain degree of uniformity. Is that an accurate summary of Bush v. Gore?
Yes, within certain parameters. For example, there's no requirement that all states follow the same patterns. It's just all voters within a particular state or within particular counties have to be treated the same, because the states are all under the US Constitution. The states are sovereign as long as they comply with basic fundamental requirements. They can have different rules. As a matter of fact, the Constitution provides that the legislatures of the states shall determine the rules for the elections in the selection of electors.
And it seems like a lot of the lawsuits, especially in the state of Pennsylvania by the Trump campaign, rested on the equal protection argument. I think their argument went like this: because of the mail-in ballots, the votes that took place in person on the day of the voting, those voters were treated differently than those who exercised the mail-in ballot option. So did that rise to the level of a violation of equal protection?
Well, it wasn't a violation of equal protection because they all had the right to do the same things. All of them could have voted either in person or by absentee or mail-in ballot. They chose to do it the way that they did it. And you can have different rules for voting different ways as long as everybody has the same options.
Okay, and in addition to that, the second prong, I believe, from the Trump campaign is that certain deficiencies were allowed to be corrected. So if the clerk received the ballot, and let's say if it did not have a date or certain other, I guess, clerical deficiencies, they were afforded a certain amount of time to make those corrections. Again, does that rise to the level of an equal rights violation, equal
So
protection.
the argument that they were making was some counties allowed the corrections and other counties did not allow them. And that's the closest that anybody came to making an argument that might fairly be an equal protection argument. The problem with it, which was highlighted by Judge Brand in the federal case that was decided the day before yesterday in Pennsylvania, is what the challengers were asking for. What Judge Brand said was there were two challengers who said that their ballots weren't counted because they made mistakes and they weren't permitted to correct them. And Judge Brand said two things. First of all, the Trump lawyers didn't provide the court with any indication or even any formula for determining whether that happened to enough people that would have changed the results of the election. But even more importantly, he said, you can't come in here and ask me to disenfranchise millions of voters because you didn't get to vote. The answer is you should be allowed to have your votes counted. Not everybody else's votes should be thrown out. And that was the flaw in the argument that they were making.
Yeah, and if I may, I do have an excerpt from Judge Brand's ruling that came down on the 21st. So this is hot off the press. Again, I'm just going to read an excerpt, and I'd like to get Barry's feedback on how significant this ruling is. So it starts out, in other words, plaintiffs, that being the Trump campaign, asks this court to disenfranchise almost 7 million voters. This court has been unable to find any case in which a plaintiff has sought such a drastic remedy in the contest of an election in terms of the sheer volume of votes asked to be invalidated. One might expect that when seeking such a startling outcome, a plaintiff would come formidably armed with compelling legal arguments and factual proof of rampant corruption, such that this court would have no option but to regrettably grant the proposed injunctive relief, despite the impact it would have on such a large group of citizens. This has not happened. Instead, this court has been presented with strained legal arguments without merit and speculative accusations, unpled in the operative complaint and unsupported by evidence. In the United States of America, this cannot justify the disenfranchisement of a single voter, let alone all the voters of the 6th most populated state. Our people, laws, and institutions demand more. At bottom, plaintiffs have failed to meet their burden to state a claim upon which a relief may be granted. Therefore, I must grant defendants' motion to dismiss and dismiss plaintiff's action with prejudice. And let's start out with that with prejudice part. If you could explain what that means, and then let's kind of work our way back.
When something is dismissed without prejudice, it means that the party can come back and try again. So often what a court will do is dismiss without prejudice and then give the plaintiff so many days to file an amended complaint. The reason he said with prejudice in this case is because of the time element. He didn't want anybody to use it for delay, and he said you haven't presented any case at all, so you don't have any right a second crack at this. Let me make one more comment about Judge Brand. Whatever your political views are and however you feel about this election, everybody should take a great deal of pride in how the judiciary handled itself in this election, particularly the federal judiciary. In my experience, and I practice a great deal in federal court, with rare exceptions, our federal judges are men and women of high integrity. And once they're elected, they rise above the issue of who appointed them. Presidents have been surprised many times at what justices they appointed did, which was contrary to what they wanted. Now, what happened here was the Trump lawyers were hoping that when they got to Judge Brand, he was going to decide in their favor because of his background. He's a lifelong conservative Republican. He belongs to the NRA, as I said. He belongs to the Federalist Society. He is everything that Trump was looking for when he appointed judges, and they thought he was going to help them. he not only didn't help them, he wrote a stringent, scathing opinion. Every judge who heard a case that was filed by the Trump lawyers, which includes Republicans and Democrats, ruled against them. The reason you should be proud of that, whatever your political view is because they rose above the politics. And they looked at the complaints and they correctly said, the complaints don't have any legal substance and you haven't given us any facts. If we didn't have judges we could rely on to call it like it is, then none of the rest of this stuff would make any difference.
But in a courtroom, aren't there also penalties and sanctions for attorneys that bring suits on frivolous grounds?
Yeah, there certainly are. I don't know if that'll happen in this case because I suspect that when it's over, everybody's just going to want to put this behind them. But yeah, absolutely.
Okay. The other, I guess, reporting that I've seen in the media is it seems like they tend to conflate an affidavit and evidence. Seems like those two terms are used interchangeably. Maybe you could sort of explain how one is has a different burden of proof versus the other.
Sometimes affidavits are evidence. It depends upon what it is that is being introduced for. Generally, though, affidavits are the door into the courtroom. It's sworn testimony, which is enough for the court to determine that it justifies going forward. Sometimes you submit affidavits on summary judgment motions. Summary judgment motions say to the court, there are no factual disputes here, so there's no reason for a trial. The only reason you have trials is to weigh and determine disputes of fact. And so one party submits affidavits that swears that these are the facts. And if the other party can submit contrary affidavits, then you go to trial. If not, the case is decided. But they are not, if you have a case that has to go to trial, you can't try it on the affidavits. You have to bring in witnesses to testify. So what Judge Brand said, and in fact, every other judge that has ruled in those cases, is you haven't provided me, even by affidavit, enough to go forward. Let me, by the way, I don't want to take up all the time here, but let me mention one other really important issue here. You have to prove, you have to show a court two things to be able to go forward on a case for fraud. One of them is you have to have some credible evidence that there was real fraud. And the second is you have to be able to show that that fraud, or even that possible fraud, affected enough ballots to change the results of the election. You can't walk into the courtroom showing that you have something that might have affected 500 votes when the difference was 58,000 votes. We're not going to look at it.
Estamos pensando y he llegado a la conclusión de que sí vas a tener tu castigo. Yo sé que algún día yo voy a tener el mío, porque en esta vida, en este mundo, nadie se salva de su vida. ¿Y qué castigo pensaste para mí?
Sorry about that. All right, we just had to unmute somebody for the background noise. But Barry, you're saying about fraud. Can you please continue?
Yeah, that's it. You have to show credible evidence of fraud. And you have to show that it would have affected or might have affected enough ballots to change the election, which nobody showed in any of these cases. You can't come in with two voters who said fraud. By the way, going back to what Martin said, one of the things in this country, which is both a disadvantage and an advantage, is that we are so disparate. We've got so many different officials handling elections. We've got so many different jurisdictions where elections take place. Can you imagine the extraordinary complexity of a fraud that would be big enough to affect the presidential election? You couldn't do it in this country. Look how many people would have to be involved in it, in how many places. You just couldn't do it. And as Martin pointed out, there are too many levels of protection. And
okay,
it's never happened. It happens in those examples that you saw. It happens in local elections where somebody wins by 16 votes. That's where it happens.
Okay, so let's direct this question to Matthew.
I'm sorry, Matthew. I called you Martin. I mean Matthew.
That's all right. I've been called worse. No worries.
Yeah, people call me Richard all the time.
So again, Matthew, record number of voters did in fact vote through by mail. I mean, isn't that susceptible to a potential abuse, irregularity, possible fraud?
I mean, absolutely, but on a small scale. I mean, again, if you go to that Heritage Foundation database, I mean, you could have, and this almost certainly happened in this election because it happens in every election, but you know, you call them irregularities, not, you know, massive conspiracies. But in that heritage fraud database, you had situations where, you know, somebody would go to his grandmother's nursing home, and somebody there would say, hey, we've got 30 ballots here. Can you drop these off to the post office? And he would, and would get busted for it. Now, there are kind of fraud conspiracies where you go to nursing homes and con elderly people into, you know, fraudulent ballots and stuff. And you know, that has been caught before. And then there's also these kind of innocuous ones where somebody's doing their grandmother's nursing home a favor. But we're talking about, you know, I mean, even if you were generous and it was a giant nursing home and it involved hundreds of ballots, you know, the Bush versus Gore was remarkable because of how narrow the margin was. All those votes cast in Florida, and the final margin was like 530 votes or something. You look at the margins in this election. You know, Michigan's like 150,000, Pennsylvania's over 100,000. Like, there aren't enough, you know, nursing homes and conspirators in order to pull something like that off without somebody saying, this isn't right. Like, I'm going to call the cops on this. Or, you know, if you were trying to that's kind of what I say to people who are saying, don't you think there could have been something there? Is like, imagine if I gave you $1 billion to fix an election. So basically money was not an issue. What you would need to do in order to pull it off, the number of people you would have to rope into the conspiracy. How could you ensure that not one of those people was a Trump fan who would say, I'm not in on this. I'm calling the cops and blowing this thing up, and I'm going to be a national hero. So just the you know, the level of fraud that would have to happen would, you know, create a paper. I mean, Barry was talking about affidavits. Anybody can do a sworn affidavit. Like, we could do a newspaper story saying somebody's filed 2 sworn affidavits saying, you know, there was fraud going on here. But if we were doing a deep dive story into that, we would reach out to that person and say, okay, where's the evidence? Like, you know, do you have phone records? Do you have an email from this person? Like, you know, how did they pay you? Was it in cash or check? And, you know, how did you guys communicate the fraud? Like, are there phone records you could show us? Like, such a thing would be so complicated. It would create a paper trail of some sort where all the evidence would be pointing to it. And the idea that you could pull something like that off, even in just one state, much less multiple states, without creating a paper trail, or you know, gathering in enough conspirators to blow the lid on the whole thing, it's impossible.
Okay. Let me ask a question that's on the other end of the spectrum. And I think this is an instance where we look at one thing these days and 2 sets of people look at it in a whole different view. So you have one, you know, let's say the people that are in the right of center, they believe that there is a systemic, massive voter fraud. But on the other hand, you had a former DHS director, Christopher Krebs. I think he's the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency under the DHS. And the statement that he gave, he put out there was that this was the most secure election in history. There was no evidence of any votes being deleted, purged, lost, etc., compromised. So it seems like that's a pretty kind of like on the other end of the extreme kind of scenario too. Again, how can they show that this was the most secure election when you have all these paper mail that just, you know, being transmitted through the system?
Well, I mean, again, it's evidence, and you know, the people make it sound like these ballots are just being sent out and they could go anywhere. I mean, Rudy Giuliani said, you know, Mickey Mouse could be filling it out, but like, you know, Mickey Mouse would have had to have, you know, registered to vote. like those ballots are tied to voter rolls, and there's like a unique ID number on those. So you can't just, somebody's not in their basement just printing out tons of ballots and sending those in, and those are getting counted. So, I mean, again, I'm certain there were irregularities in this election, just like there are with any election. But it's not, it's not something like in the 2000 election with the butterfly ballot, where you had, elderly Jewish residents voting for Pat Buchanan accidentally, kind of the antithesis of the candidate they would want to vote for. There were no kind of mass irregularities. And kind of the proof of that is that you've got, Giuliani and Jenna Ellis saying there are, making all these wild claims about Venezuela and but then when it comes to court, the judges are saying, and by the way, this is not just a post-election issue. In the year running up to the election, there were about 36 different, challenges going on in courtrooms across the country, where they were trying, the Trump campaign was trying to kind of limit access to the vote. And the kind of centerpiece of their arguments was this idea that this is going to open up all this voter fraud. And invariably, it comes down to a judge saying, okay, these are pretty big claims. Let's see the evidence of it. And they have been unable to provide evidence of mass voter fraud in any of these, not just in the post-election, but even in these several dozen cases before the election. So, you're kind of in the way you pose the question is kind of like a, when did you stop beating your wife thing, where you're asking for evidence of something that doesn't exist. But it's, where is the evidence that there were mass irregularities and everything like that? That evidence would have, kind of emerged at this point with all these people looking for it and so much attention on it.
Right. It was not really intended to be a leading question. It was more like a commentary, like a commentary on, again, two people could look at the same thing. 70% of Trump supporters think there was massive election fraud, but then you have a DHS director who comes out and says this was the most secure. So it just seems like this is such a night and day comparison. And how do you explain that discrepancy? That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. But
I'd like to take a crack at that. First of all, and by the way, the problem in 2000 was setting aside the butterfly ballot, which was unique in itself. And that was, by the way, taken care of in one day in a single hearing, and that was gone. The punch card ballot was physically defective. It knocked those things out and it rejected things all the time. But almost every, and that was widespread. I think most of the jurisdictions in the country used it at that time. They all got rid of it after 2000. And almost all jurisdictions now use the ballot, whether you do it in person or by mail, where you take a pen or a pencil and you fill in the little bubbles. Those have proved to be highly reliable. That's one of the reasons we didn't have a big problem this year. The other thing is, when that person said it was the most reliable, that's probably true. You can have a lot of confidence, and here's the reason. If you have ever gotten a call or an email or a text from your credit card company saying, did you make this charge? The reason for that is that the credit card companies have gotten increasingly more sophisticated at creating algorithms that pick up things that don't seem right. For example, I made a charge once. I was about to get on a plane from the East Coast to the West Coast. I made a charge at the airport, and then I made a charge in the other, and I immediately got a call from my credit card company wanting to know if I made both charges, because their algorithm picked up the fact that they got two charges on the same credit card within too short a period of time on both coasts. Well, that happens all the time now. It's the same thing now with voting. All of these voting areas now, these voting precincts or authorities, have computer algorithms that pick up stuff that don't make sense. You have a number on every ballot. That number, as Matthew pointed out, has to be consistent with the voter who supposedly is voting it. But if that number is voted more than once, it's immediately picked up. If it's voted inappropriately for any reason, it's picked up immediately. The signature Now, by the way, some states compare signatures by computer, some don't bother. It doesn't really mean that much. Here's the point. You cannot, and this is what Matthew said, because, and I don't even know all of the fail safes that they have because they don't make them public, but you can't do this on a massive scale. The main way you can do it, you can't vote more than once. The main way you can do this is by filling out somebody else's ballot in a family or in a group home or something. That's really the only way you can create a fraud today, whether it's by mail or in person. I mean, anybody can walk in person and give false ID and copy somebody's signature, but you're talking about a dozen votes, not 100,000 votes.
I think there was another, it may be the same Miami election I was thinking of, it could be another one, but there was some group home in South Florida with like for schizophrenics, and they had a very high return rate on their absentee ballots, all for one candidate. And this was like in the mid 90s or something. That was flagged as suspicious. I don't know if they had, I can't remember the outcome of it, but again, there aren't enough group homes and conspirators in order to, get the tens of thousands or even over 100,000 votes all going for the same candidate in order to pull something like that off.
Incidentally, Thomas, so Matthew and I are completely agreeing with that, but you said, why are these two extremes? There are two extremes because there are too many people in this country who are willing to listen to whatever they hear from the person they support without demanding anything to support it. And Trump has harnessed that with his core group. And they'll do whatever he tells them, even if it makes no sense at all, which is a danger in democracy. I don't care who you support. If it was Biden doing that, I would be just as concerned about it. The reason you can't have a democracy unless you have a skeptical group of citizens who demand that people back up whatever they say, no matter which side of the political spectrum they're on.
Yeah, I think it's the old saying, like, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And, that is why the legal system has been fantastic and has, kind of acquitted itself well through this process. Is it ultimately comes down to presenting facts in front of a judge. And when it comes down to that, the Trump team's been unable to do so. And that's kind of why we're in the position we are right now. We're heading towards a Biden election.
Well, one last question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience for Q&A. But I guess the last comment from Matthew was, looks like we're heading in for President-elect Biden's presidency. I guess not so fast, because again, if we're making comparison to 2020 to year 2000, the Trump campaign still has some legal recourse. They still have some avenues that they could explore, including bringing this case up to the Supreme Court of the United States for review. Barry, maybe you could just comment on the likelihood of that even happening procedurally. And if it were to get there, to reach the 9 justices, who, by the way, have very different views on the precedents set in Bush v. Gore, how will that turn out?
Generally, lawyers don't like to make predictions, but I'll make one to you now, which is that the US Supreme Court will not even look at this case. The US Supreme Court is unique among courts because they don't have to take any case. Every case they take is discretionary. They take it only if they choose to. I have been saying from the beginning, I said this on November 4th when I was asked by a number of media outlets, that I believe that the US Supreme Court would not take this case unless they absolutely had to, because they did not want to choose the president. They're very jealous of the fact that among the 3 branches, they have the highest level consistently of confidence by the American public. And Justice Roberts in particular is really committed to keeping that level of competence. I don't think they wanted to get involved in this. And there's only one way that they would have had no choice. And that's if there were decisions in 2 different states that went in the opposite way, one for Biden and one for Trump, and either one would have determined who the president was. In that case, the US Supreme Court would have had no choice but to take it. But that doesn't exist here. There's no basis here. There's nothing for the Supreme Court to decide. The decision that was made in Philadelphia by Judge Brand when he said there's no facts, there's no legal argument, is true. The Supreme Court is not going to take this case. Now, I can tell you all that if they take the case, I'll be very embarrassed. I think it'll be a mistake, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think that, and by the way, I think that the Third Circuit, which is the appellate court, considering Judge Brand's decision, is going to affirm him. They're going to do one of two things. They're either going to affirm him very quickly, they're going to put it on a fast track, or they're not going to do anything until after Biden is certified, and then they'll quietly affirm him. But they will affirm him. I'm confident of that. And then it's going to be over.
Although, again, let's stay with the Third Circuit. If they affirm the lower court's ruling, then can the Trump campaign fast track it to SCOTUS, just like how Bush v. Gore was also fast tracked from the Florida's highest court into the Supreme Court of the U.S.?
Well, the lawyers can't fast track it. The only one that can fast track it is the justices. They have to, you file a petition, and the justices either deny a certiorari, which means they're not going to take the case, or they grant it, and then if they want to, they fast track it. I don't think they would grant certiorari here. I do not think they are going to elect to look at anything thus far. Again, I could be surprised, but I'm pretty confident that they're not going to take this case.
Right.
The
I think
issue is that Pennsylvania is just one state. Even if Pennsylvania was overturned and went to Trump, Biden would still have enough electoral votes.
That's another reason. They don't like to do things for no reason. And particularly when they have Justice Roberts telling them, don't get involved in this if you don't have to.
Right. Okay. Well, let's go to the next segment. Audience, there's going to be plenty of questions. Please use the app function to raise your hand. And we just ask that one question per person for now, unless, if we have more time later. And please be sure that your question is indeed a question and not a rhetorical statement. So let's go with, the first hand is from Ellen. So we'll go with Ellen, and then after that, we'll go with Nirav. So Ellen is first. Go ahead.
I'm wondering why I haven't heard any discussion about the fact that there were anywhere from 200 to 250 lawsuits across the country trying to have states change their election rules. And in Georgia, the Secretary of State signed a consent decree with Stacey Abrams in March without going through the legislature, just signed a consent decree with her. In Pennsylvania, the judge decided to extend the days that ballots could be counted. We have examples where election rules were changed without going through the legislature, which is in the Constitution. And so isn't it fair to say that the fraud, quote unquote, was in the massive effort by Democratic entities to change election laws before the election without going through the legislature?
Well, you raised several interesting issues, and I will address as many as I can remember. Your question is a very reasonable one. The U.S. Supreme Court, when I said the U.S. Supreme Court wouldn't take this case, I mean they won't take the case to decide the presidency. They actually, surprisingly, took 5 cases early on that they looked at pretty quickly. And there was a pattern that emerged. Initially, people said they were all over the place. First, they're deciding that they're going to uphold a lower court, and then they're deciding they're not going to uphold it. But after people looked at it more carefully, they saw what the pattern was. And the pattern was this: if a state court made a decision which was based upon an interpretation of state law, either its constitution or its statute, the US Supreme Court didn't reverse it. They said that's a matter for the state to decide, and we're not going to deal with it. On the other hand, if federal judges stepped in and did something contrary to what had been decided by the state courts, no matter which way it went, the Supreme Court reversed it. They basically were saying to the federal courts, stay out of this. It's a matter for a state decision. So that's why the Supreme Court was not getting involved. Now, what you're saying is, it seems wrong that a state should make those changes contrary to its law or its constitution. I can't argue with you about that. The states and their courts make those decisions.
But I'm talking about the Constitution of the United States, Article 2, where it says that the election laws go through the legislature. What right did the Secretary of State in Georgia have to sign a consent decree with Stacey Abrams representing one party in an election?
Well, you make a good point, and your point also applied in Philadelphia, because what they did in Philadelphia is the Supreme Court said that a provision of our Constitution takes precedence over a statutory provision. And the argument that was made, and I think it was a rational argument, one of the few rational arguments that were raised by the Trump lawyers here, was, but the Constitution says that the state legislature makes that decision. Now, that's a good point. And at some point, nobody has ever addressed that question before. Does that mean that a state can violate its own constitution as long as the legislature does it with regard to electors? Nobody has decided that, and someday somebody will. The only reason I don't think the Supreme Court will decide it now is because it's not going to make any difference to the presidential election, and they're not going to get involved in it if it's not going to make a difference. It might, because it dealt with electors. It didn't deal with the Senate races. But your point is a very astute one, and it's a question that somebody eventually is going to have to answer. Let me mention one other thing that it brings to mind, which I think is an interesting point that hardly anybody knows about. You know that Trump was trying to persuade some of the legislatures to take control of the delegates and to decide to send a Trump delegation. In 2000, the United States Supreme Court had a statement in one of its cases that wasn't noticed by a lot of people, where they said that a state the state cannot change the rules of the election after the election. The legislature can't come in and change it after the election, which is one of the points that you were making. The US Supreme Court actually said that. You were talking about before the election, but they said you can't do it after the election. I don't know of any state that authorizes its legislature to choose delegates, which means the only way they could have done it in Michigan or Philadelphia was for the legislature to pass a statute after the election doing that, which is not permitted under the US Constitution.
All right, well, that I don't know about, but all I know is that there were changes made to election law by the Secretary of State in Georgia, the judges in Pennsylvania, and that counting got extended for days, even though the Constitution says election day is November 3rd. And so I think it's fair to say that a lot of people in the country are very angry because they feel the fraud was done this way. The fraud was not done in the way that you folks are focusing on. It was done in the underlying structure of changing the way the rules work and favoring mail-in ballots over which favored a particular candidate. And so that's why there's such a high percentage of people that think this was a fraudulent election.
Well, you threw in another issue there. I had told you that I think that you have a good point with regard to the Philadelphia disregarding what the legislature did. However, the issue of voting being on November 3rd, the Constitution, not the Constitution, federal law says the election of the president has to take place on the same day, but that has nothing to do with counting votes that were for the election on that day. So, for example, nobody has ever said that it is a violation of federal law for a state to count votes that were postmarked as of election day, but came in late. That's a different issue. And that's just a matter of state law. It doesn't violate federal law. At least no court has ever held that it did.
But it was the judge that made that change. It didn't go through the.
Yeah, I know, but I would just caution you for the state, for the sake of our national unity and civility, we need to be careful about what we call fraud. I think, as I said, that you are identifying some real issues, but I wouldn't say that they're fraud. You know, my life is spent in a courtroom, and judges come to different decisions. And sometimes I agree with them, sometimes I disagree with them. What the court did in Philadelphia, the Supreme Court made a decision. And by the way, judges are appointed because of their, because we've never figured out a better way to do it. We can't do it with a computer. So judges are appointed by presidents and governors based upon their historic ideology. So judge is conservative. He believes that the law should be interpreted according to what it says. Another judge is more liberal and believes that the law has to be a living law, which has to be changed. They're two different philosophies, and they're appointed because of those philosophies. They're not corrupt if they honestly look at the facts and the law, and they make a decision where there is room for the application of their personal philosophy. That doesn't make them corrupt, and it doesn't make it fraud, even if we may disagree with it. And I think what you're saying, which is absolutely fair, is that you think that judges should not be activists and interpret the law the way they please. That's fair, but I don't think the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was fraudulent when they did that. They just made an interpretation.
Okay, that's your interpretation, but my own interpretation is there's not going to be unity after this election because half the country doesn't like the way this was handled.
Okay, that's Ellen, I'm just going to interject. That's a political matter. We'll get to that later. Right now, we're talking about the litigation that unfolded in the courtroom. But speaking of Pennsylvania, I do want to just illustrate on another point, because this kind of shows the kind of lack of proof regarding some kind of like a systemic fraud. So in the Pennsylvania case, Judge Brand's opinion, he cites this Act 77, which was passed by the Pennsylvania legislature, which is controlled by, guess who? The Republicans. And they expanded the vote by mail option. Before, you had to have some kind of an excuse, whether if it's medical or some other qualifying condition. That act, which was passed last year before the pandemic, it expanded the availability for voters to exercise that option. So coincidentally, when the pandemic struck, many voters opted in with that option. So it just worked out, I guess, to the voters' benefit. Now, was that some sort of a systemic fraud to get one party elected versus the other? I don't think so. But I think we live in a society where we are highly skeptical of any kind of outcome because we think it's just all motivated by partisan determinations, but it's not. So I do take your point, Ellen, but we do need to move on. Let's see. Nirav has a question, so go ahead.
All right. Before the question, one quick clarification. I think you said judges are appointed, and in some places they're elected. Ed Borer even pointed that out in the chat. So my question is about standardization. You mentioned this earlier on in Florida, and it was part of the Q&A. So although Article 1, Section 4 talks about, specifically for elections to Congress, that states can decide how to run elections, it also leaves room for the federal government or Congress to set rules itself. So what room is there legally or politically to standardize elections nationwide?
Well, first of all, by the way, I'm well aware of the fact that we elect some judges. Florida elects all of our trial level judges, and I think it's terrible, but I was referring to those that are appointed. That again, I mean, you guys know what you're talking about, and you're coming up with some interesting and undecided questions. Ordinarily, I think that you would say that the federal government would be able to standardize voting, except for the fact that we have a provision in the U.S. Constitution, which is one of the things that occurred when when our forefathers were trying to create this balance between a federal system and the sovereign states, that says that they were very specific that the state legislatures shall determine the rules for the selection of electors. And by the way, US senators, which used to be in every state selected by the legislatures, not by popular vote. So I don't know any case where that's been addressed, but that would be the issue, is could the federal government standardize voting given that provision in the Constitution.
Well, and is it under that provision that Congress set voting day, like the election day?
Well, the election day is not the rules. That's not how the provision on setting the rules has been interpreted. That's been interpreted as being what kind of voting machines you use, how they're counted, things of that nature. At least I'm not aware of anybody addressing that. I think that a lot of this, as you all might know, came about after the 1876 election, which was a debacle in itself. And that's when we passed all of these complicated rules about what happens. That's when we created the rule that said that the Electoral College, a state has to finally decide who its delegates are. I think it's 6 days before the Electoral College meets, which you all probably know doesn't meet in one place. They meet separately in each state. But so that's why they pass all these federal rules. I don't know, by the way, that anybody's ever challenged that issue, that the vote would be one day everywhere.
Well, I didn't mean it one day. I just mean that since Congress set the Tuesday after the first Monday in federal law, is it under that provision that they could do other things as well?
Well, that provision would seem to be inconsistent with Congress saying that the election shall be on this day everywhere in the country. But
okay,
I don't know, it's been challenged.
I'm not an expert on the Help America Vote Act. It's been a long time since I even paid attention to it, but that may be one way where, kind of national politicians could kind of dictate how states do it by tying federal funds to, which is what they did with HAVA. But otherwise, they've left it up to the states.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Questions? While we're waiting for the next question, I do have another one for Barry. Again, as a lawyer who litigated 47 cases in the year 2000 on these election contests, how would you rate Trump's legal team? Again, just take out the veneer of the partisan commentary for a second. Just their sheer legal ability to prevail or not prevail in the court of law. How would you rate them?
I try to make it a policy not to make critical statements about other lawyers, so I would have to not comment here.
That was very
Look, the point is this. I didn't see what they did. I've read the opinions. I haven't read what was filed. I would not have filed any of these cases. And like you said at the beginning, I've represented Republicans and Democrats, governors, presidents, congressmen. I separate my politics from my profession. But I feel very strongly about the fact that lawyers have an obligation not to file cases unless they have at least an arguable legal position and a factual basis. And they didn't. They really didn't. No matter how strongly you feel, no matter how much you support Trump, they had no legal basis for any of these cases. The closest that it came, which Ellen commented on, was the first or one of the first Philadelphia cases that was challenging what the Supreme Court did based upon the fact that they were violating what the legislature said. That was a legitimate point. It turned out not to matter because it didn't affect the election.
I believe one of the challenge. I'm sorry, go ahead, Barry.
The matter was the votes that came in after Election Day, and there weren't enough of them to make a difference. That's why it became moot. But it was a fair argument that they were making. Most of these other arguments, particularly after Mr. Giuliani became involved, are just absolutely without basis.
Okay, and in your experience, is there a difference between election monitoring versus observation? Because in one of the cases in Pennsylvania, I believe that's one of the basis for seeking the injunctive relief is that the Republican designated individuals did not have meaningful access, that's the term of art, to observe these ballots. Is that even a legally viable position to stand on?
Well, the problem in that case was that the court pointed out that they didn't say the Republicans didn't have an opportunity and the Democrats did. They said it was conceded that everybody was treated the same way. They just didn't like the fact that they were moved back too far to be able to see what was happening. The court in that case, it was one of the two cases where Trump team actually won. This was very early on, ordered that they be permitted to get closer. But the thing is this, there is no requirement in law that you even have poll watchers. I mean, states have individual laws, but there's certainly no federal or US constitutional provision that entitles a candidate to poll watchers. They can eliminate them altogether. So that was a tempest in a teacup. It was just a question of how close can all of us get? To jump from that to the assumption that there was a fraud going on and they didn't want people to see what was happening is a big jump. What they said was that they moved them back because of the 6-foot COVID restrictions. And they were saying, well, they moved us a lot more than 6 feet back. So that's what the argument was. But, you know, ultimately it didn't make any difference. And nobody showed that there was any miscount. I mean, they've had 2 recounts now. Nobody showed that any was counted wrong.
Okay, let's go to the next question. Looks like Nirav, you have your hand up again. Go ahead.
This is a question for Matthew. So you talked about the Heritage Foundation's database of fraud cases, and that goes back to '82. A lot of people like to talk about instances of fraud farther back in American history. And what are your thoughts on, I guess, what has changed in the country and, you know, culture, laws, et cetera, that has made that type of fraud not really a thing anymore? So examples that people talk about are the 1960 election with JFK and potential things happening in Chicago, and also, like, you know, even in New York City history when Tammany Hall and such, which is much older, but also was clearly like conspiratorial fraud.
Well, first of all, kudos on the Cloud City background.
I was just going to say that.
Thank you.
I'm the bigger Star
Now
Wars
also is floating around in space.
Yeah. I mean, you know, 1960 might as well be another planet for where we are right now. I mean, in 1960, a computer could take up this entire room I'm sitting in and have less computing power than my iPhone. So, you know, I'm sure it was easier to pull something like that off, particularly if you like focused on an area like Chicago or something like that. Now, like Barry said, you know, you travel and swipe your credit card, and all of a sudden they know they're checking with you to make sure it's not fraud going on. It's just, you know, there are computer programs and traps in place to catch those kind of things that just nobody even thought of in the 1960s. I mean, even in the 1980s, I mean, I talked about those Miami elections in the mid 90s. You know, we're in a totally different world now than we were even in Bush versus Gore. I mean, that led to the rise of machine counting and all that in elections, you know, nationwide. So it's almost pointless to compare how they deal with it now to how it was in the Kennedy era, I think.
So Matthew, in one of the articles that you had posted, they talk about this Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. So whatever happened to that?
Nothing happened with it. I mean, if everybody remembers, you know, Trump didn't like that he lost the popular vote in 2016 and said, I didn't really lose the popular vote. It was because millions and millions of illegals voted, and he formed that the Voter Fraud Commission, and Chris Kobach, who then was like Secretary of State of Kansas, big kind of voter fraud champion, you know, anti-voter fraud champion. I believe he, this may be myth, but I believe he printed out the heritage fraud database and carried it with him, and it was photographed at this White House task force meeting. And I believe they spent like 7 months with the power of the presidency behind him to get at the voter fraud that allegedly happened in 2016. And they disbanded after 7 months with nothing to show for it. So again, that is, it's easy to create the myth of voter fraud, but actually coming up with evidence of it has so far proven impossible for the people championing it.
Okay, and I know somebody mentioned about verifying signatures, so having like these machines that could authenticate signatures. Do you think that's another way that states should adopt to safeguard the election integrity?
Well, yeah, I mean, and they do that already. I was concerned before the election that the signature issue was what we were going to be talking about afterwards. And it was kind of like a nightmare scenario because, the signatures were kind of more than anything else is kind of a subjective thing. I mean, some places use computer algorithms to compare the signatures, but other places you've got a poll worker just kind of looking at it. And if you fished out a document that you signed 20 years ago and compared it to something you signed last week, you probably noticed that your own signature has changed quite a bit. So, I was worried that we were going to be in a situation where, as journalists, we are covering, in multiple states, lawyers arguing signature by signature, which just would have been endless. So I'm glad we're not at that point. But anyway, to answer your question, that already happens, the signature verification thing, whether it's by computer or by eyeballing it. And, a lot of ballots are rejected because the signatures don't match up. And media has done stories finding people who have had their ballots rejected improperly. So, it can be a disenfranchisement issue. And kind of to go back to the point Ellen was making about, these kind of things being fraud, like these rules that are created apply to everybody. So, it's not like an equal protection type issue, but like the signature thing, after elections, we can measure, and this is in that story we did, you can measure who's disproportionately impacted by some of these, issues that lead to ballot rejections. And what we find over and over again is the states that take like the strictest interpretation of the law, it tends to penalize minority precincts. So that, this is not a country that is supposed to be disenfranchising, classes of voters. But we, when you do a statistical analysis after the election, we find that is often the case. So I think some of the measures that were adopted before this election because of COVID were meant to expand the vote and decrease the disenfranchisement that had gone on in previous elections.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to the next question. Rory, go ahead.
Thank you. I'd just like to take a issue, if you want to address it as a question. I live in New Jersey. I'm in politics. I live in Essex County, which is one of the most corrupt. Our town clerk was, they filed a charge because they just pulled ballots out and walked out in open boxes, which were supposed to be sealed. And I know you're trying to convince everybody, maybe by your writings, that it's honest. It's not. Here in Essex County, where everybody was watching it, they found that like 97 people who were dead voted, and they didn't know how to take the votes out, so they got counted anyway. So in the signature verifications, they don't really look at it on a paper ballot, because you would have to take that and go find where the person was voting from. For the most part, they just put the ballots in and they just vote, and you could see that. Now maybe I'm just confining my observations to New Jersey, but we're probably one of the most corrupt states that there is. But I can't share your opinion that it's, as far as the signature verification, it is not honest in New Jersey.
New Jersey does have a very high ballot rejection rate. New Jersey and New York have, people don't pay, and everything we've been talking about, I've been looking through the lens of the presidential election, not like an Essex County commission or election or something. I was investigations editor at Newsday on Long Island for 4 years, and that is one of the most corrupt places I've ever seen as far as politics. But I assume New Jersey could give them a run for their money. I would not close the door on the possibility of a smaller local election having a higher percentage of fraud, certainly than the presidential election. And I don't know how Essex County runs their election, so I couldn't speak intelligently about it. But just to be clear, I'm not saying that every single election, particularly it's the smaller you get, I think it's easier to pull off fraud on a smaller level when maybe you only need to swing 50 votes to get an election.
I don't know how they ever compare signatures. I mean, my signature, which they have here, is the same as the signature that I signed when I was 21 years old, and it doesn't look, it's not even close to what my signature is now. But the thing is, usually signature comparison is not that important because, as I said, they'll catch if the same voter votes more than once, that will be caught. So what you got is not people signing names to a bunch of ballots and stuffing the ballot box. You've got people voting for somebody else, usually in the family. So you're not dealing with a widespread organized fraud in that case. So I think that the signature verification thing is, we probably can find a better way to do it. Some places are experimenting with biometric verification, a thumbprint or something along that line.
On the dead voter issue, a lot of times what will happen is that is more just like an administrative error by an election official, like a John Smith Sr. Was on the voter rolls, died, John Smith Jr. voted, and an election official will just like mark it down as John Smith Sr. accidentally. I'm not saying that happens in every case. But again, like jurisdictions will bounce their voter rolls off against the Social Security Death Index, and and this was one of the folks who have been out there kind of pushing this voter fraud thing. But one of the things they've been pushing for is to clean up the voter rolls, and part of that effort is making sure that voters who have died are taken off the voter rolls. That they pitch that as like a kind of fraud effort, but as somebody who does kind of data journalism as part of my job, it's to have clean data is definitely better than having dirty data.
I think there is some legitimacy to this so-called dead voters voting, because during the stimulus check distribution in the summer, there were incidents of deceased taxpayers receiving the stimulus check. Now, you can make an argument that the standard of which the deceased person received a stimulus check is probably not as high as voter registration, but still, I think that really stirred a lot of skepticism. So,
but again, if you wanted to pull off a fraud with that, if you have a dead voter on the voter roll, I always kind of turn that around. Like, how would you pull that off? Like, if your father had passed away and is on the voter roll still, and they mail his ballot to you, yes, you could fill out his ballot, sign your, pretend to sign his name, send it out. You've stolen one vote in that case. How are you going to pull off the same maneuver with, how would you even know which voters on the voter roll are dead? And how would you get that ballot that is tied to a different address sent to you instead to fill out that ballot? So, maybe you could pull it off. It would be, to me, a miracle to pull that off 100 times. But, to do it tens of thousands of times, and, it would just be impossible.
Right. Okay. Michael has a question. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah. So Matthew, I think I heard you just say a second ago that you were talking about maybe looking at some new biometrics that some states are looking at. And I also agree that signatures can change. I mean, the way I send my credit card statement at the restaurant is different than maybe I'll sign for my mortgage or my lease or whatever it is that I'm official documents that I'm signing. So definitely there can be some discrepancy between signatures. My question is, when you're going into person to vote, what's wrong with using like an ID, driver's license, etc., instead of just a signature?
That was actually Barry that brought up the biometric thing. I mean, you know, there are two sides of the debate on the voter ID laws. You know, the Republican argument tends to be that that is a way to reduce voter fraud, is by having an ID. The Democrat side says, you know, you're creating a barrier, kind of Jim Crow-esque type barrier to voting, that, you know, not everybody has a government ID. You know, not everybody has a driver's license. Not everybody's comfortable going into a government building and getting that. So why penalize that voter? You know, I, as an impartial journalist, you know, I'm just kind of restating the state of play on either side. I don't really take sides on it. But, you know, for the ones saying that a voter ID, an ID is the only thing standing between a clean election and rampant voter fraud, I would just say there's no evidence that that is the case.
Okay, Barry, I know you have to leave shortly, so we do appreciate your time. But before you go, I do have one kind of burning question, which is not really law related, but I think it's certainly a likely scenario, which is, let's say come January 20th of next year, it's time for the president-elect to be inaugurated. And what if Donald Trump says, I'm not leaving? What happens?
Whether or not he leaves is unrelated to the inauguration of the new president. It doesn't matter whether concession doesn't mean anything. A concession is just a traditional thing. It's a courtesy. If you're talking about leaving the White House, I mean, somebody can escort him out, but I don't expect that to happen. I mean, I think that what I would like to see, and I'm afraid we may not see, is what I mentioned at the beginning, which is to Trump to ride in the limousine with Biden to the swearing in and sit beside him. Even as a kid, I was very moved by that. I thought it was such a wonderful statement of the peaceful transfer of power. And I would hate to see us lose that. But other than that, I mean, I just can't really see Trump saying, I'm not leaving the White House. You know, I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, doesn't there come a time where a newly elected commander-in-chief now has to exercise his duly delegated power to then issue an order or command enforcing his presidency to be effectuated, no?
Well, his presidency is effectuated the minute he's sworn in. He becomes the president, and his word, as far as the degree of his authority, is going to count. It doesn't make any difference what anybody else says. As far as physically leaving the White House, I mean, if it ever came to that, I imagine it would be the White House security people who would remove him. But again, I'm not going to assume that we'd ever have anything that unseemly that would occur. I suspect that at the appropriate time that Trump and his family will leave the White House. I don't think they're going to be hanging onto the furniture screaming like children that they don't want to leave.
Okay, thanks. All right, let's see. The next question is back to Nirav. Go ahead.
I keep having questions. So my questions are mostly for Barry, relating to the Voting Rights Act. And since the provision relating to the pre-approval by the Justice Department was struck down based on the old maps, what do you think of? I guess there are some cases working their way through the courts of allegations of discrimination in states' changes to voting rules. What do you think of those cases in terms of their probabilities of succeeding? Like, let's say specifically for Florida and rules relating to felons restoring the rights to votes to felons.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I haven't studied the cases. I haven't looked at what's happening in them. Sorry that I can't give you an answer, but I just haven't. I haven't been involved in any of those cases, and I just haven't studied them.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, I guess if there's no other questions, this will be a good place to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody. Thanks once again to Barry Richard and Matthew Doig. I'll certainly post links to both our panelists for their work, and we'll certainly keep following what you do. And I guess if we have to have another video conference like this in the near future, that means we might be in some sort of a constitutional crisis. So it's one of those situations where if we don't see each other via video conference, that might be a good thing. Speaking of which, our next video conference is a week from today, and it's going to be on Washington's farewell address. And spoiler alert is, guess what? He did warn us about this exact scenario. So we're going to have other guest panelists to come on and talk about that. There's going to be a short reading assignment, which is the actual address that Washington gave as he departed his presidency. So stay tuned. So once again, thank you, Barry. Thank you, Matthew. Be well. Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Good luck.